Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling streets of General Santos City as Manny Pacquiao stepped out of his black sedan. The familiar humidity of his hometown wrapped around him like an old friend's embrace, carrying the mingled scents of grilled fish from nearby vendors and the salt-tinged breeze from Sarangani Bay. At 65, the legendary boxer moved with the same measured confidence that had once dominated rings across the globe, though the years had softened the sharp edges of his once chiseled frame. Manny had returned to Gensan for a quiet weekend, seeking refuge from the relentless pace of his political duties in Manila. The city had grown considerably since his childhood days of sleeping on cardboard boxes, but certain corners still held the echoes of his poverty-stricken past. Today, he planned to visit the old Naisipit Elementary School, where he had briefly attended classes between selling newspapers and shining shoes on the streets. As he walked toward the school's weathered gates, flanked by his longtime security detail, a crowd began to gather. Children pressed their faces against classroom windows, teachers whispered excitedly to one another, and elderly residents emerged from their homes with smartphones raised high. The people's champion had returned, and news of his presence spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. But it was at the corner of Pioneer Avenue and Makar Road where fate intervened in the most unexpected way. A silver SUV pulled up alongside the school's entrance, its tinted windows reflecting the golden hour light. From the passenger seat emerged a figure that made Manny's breath catch in his throat, a man whose presence immediately transported him back 3 decades to smoke-filled arenas and the deafening roar of bloodthirsty crowds. Miguel Torres, the Mexican warrior who had shared the ring with Manny twice during the peak of their careers, stood before him for the first time in nearly 15 years. The years had been equally kind and cruel to the former featherweight champion. His once jet-black hair had turned completely silver, and deep lines etched stories of countless battles around his dark eyes. But those same eyes still held the fire that had made him one of Mexico's most beloved fighters. The street seemed to pause in recognition of this moment. Vendors stopped their calls, children's laughter faded to whispers, and even the ever-present traffic noise seemed to diminish. 2 legends stood facing each other on an ordinary street corner in the Philippines, their shared history hanging between them like morning mist over rice fields. Manny felt his heart rate quicken, not from excitement, but from the complex emotions that memories could stir. Their 2 fights had been brutal affairs, the first a narrow victory for Manny, the second an equally contested win for Miguel. But beyond the scorecards and title belts, there had been something deeper, a mutual respect forged in blood, sweat, and the pursuit of greatness that only true warriors could understand. Miguel's security team maintained a respectful distance as the 2 men stood motionless, each seeming to study the changes that time had carved into the other's face. The Filipino crowd began to recognize the significance of this encounter, phones emerging to capture what would surely become a viral moment across social media platforms worldwide. Neither man had planned this meeting. Miguel was in the Philippines for the first time, visiting at the invitation of a local boxing promoter who was organizing charity exhibitions. The coincidence felt almost orchestrated by forces beyond their control, as if the boxing gods themselves had arranged this reunion on the streets where one of them had first learned to fight, not for glory, but for survival. The weight of their shared past settled over them both, and in that moment, the entire boxing world held its breath. The recognition was instant and mutual. Miguel's weathered face softened as decades of memories flooded back, while Manny felt his chest tighten with emotions he hadn't experienced since hanging up his gloves for the final time. The crowd around them began to murmur in hushed tones, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold in real time. Manny remembered their first encounter vividly, the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, 1998, when both men were at the absolute peak of their physical powers. Miguel had been the betting favorite, his devastating left hook having claimed 17 consecutive victories leading up to their bout. But that night, Manny had fought with the desperation of a man carrying the hopes of an entire nation on his shoulders, each punch thrown not just for personal glory, but for every Filipino who had ever dreamed of rising above their circumstances. The Mexican fighter's mind traveled to similar places. He recalled watching footage of Manny's early fights, studying the young Filipino's unorthodox style that seemed to defy every conventional boxing wisdom. Miguel had spent months preparing for their encounter, yet nothing could have readied him for the hurricane of leather that Manny had unleashed that night. The loss had stung, but even in defeat, Miguel recognized he had shared the ring with something special, a fighter whose heart was as dangerous as his hands. Their second meeting, 2 years later in Mexico City, had been even more brutal. Miguel fought with the fury of a man seeking redemption on home soil, while Manny battled to prove their first encounter hadn't been a fluke. The altitude had worked against the Filipino champion, his usually inexhaustible cardio betraying him in the thin air of the Mexican capital. Miguel's victory that night had been decisive but earned, a masterpiece of tactical boxing that showcased his ring intelligence at its finest. Now standing on this humid street corner, both men carried the invisible scars of those wars. Miguel's left shoulder, surgically repaired 3 times, ached with the memory of overextension. Manny unconsciously touched his right temple, where a barely visible scar remained from a cut that had nearly ended their second fight prematurely. The crowd had grown to nearly 200 people, with Angelo, a local tricycle driver, abandoning his vehicle to push closer for a better view. Beside him, Ligaya, an elderly woman who ran a nearby sari-sari store, clutched her rosary beads while whispering prayers of gratitude for witnessing such a moment. Children squeezed between adult legs, their young eyes wide with wonder at seeing their hero standing so close to someone who had once been his greatest adversary. Social media began exploding as photos and videos of the encounter spread across platforms. Boxing analysts in ESPN offices scrambled to dig up old footage, while retired fighters from around the world watched their phones in amazement. The hashtag Pacquiao Torres began trending globally within minutes, as fans shared their own memories of those legendary battles. But for Manny and Miguel, the outside world had faded to background noise. They stood locked in a moment of silent communication that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. The respect they had developed through violence had matured into something deeper during their years apart, an understanding that only 2 men who had pushed each other to their absolute limits could share. Miguel took a tentative step forward, his movement careful and deliberate. The gesture was small but significant, a bridge across the chasm of time and geography that had separated them for so long. Manny's response was equally measured, his own step reducing the distance between them to mere arm's length. The boxing world watched through countless screens as 2 legends prepared to complete a conversation that had been interrupted 15 years earlier, when the final bell of their last encounter had ended not just a fight, but what both men now realized had been the beginning of an unfinished story. The distance between them had shrunk to barely 3 feet, close enough for each man to see the traces of old battles etched into the other's features. Miguel's nose, broken twice during their era, bore a slight deviation that Manny remembered causing during a particularly fierce exchange in their first fight. Similarly, Miguel could trace the thin line above Manny's left eyebrow, where his own uppercut had opened a cut that required 12 stitches. The crowd had formed a respectful semicircle around them, with Bayani, a local basketball coach, gently directing children to maintain distance while ensuring everyone could witness this historic moment. Mothers lifted toddlers onto their shoulders, while elderly men who remembered listening to their fights on crackling radios pushed forward with tears beginning to form in their weathered eyes. Manny found himself studying Miguel's hands, those same instruments that had once delivered punishment with scientific precision. The knuckles were more pronounced now, slightly swollen from decades of impact, and a subtle tremor in the left hand suggested the early stages of the neurological concerns that haunted many fighters of their generation. Yet those hands had also fed Miguel's family, built schools in his hometown of Guadalajara, and provided scholarships for hundreds of disadvantaged Mexican youth. Miguel's gaze moved to Manny's eyes, searching for the same burning intensity that had made the Filipino such a dangerous opponent. What he found instead was something even more powerful, a deep contentment mixed with wisdom that only came from a life fully lived. The hunger that had once driven Manny to wake at 4 in the morning for road work had been replaced by a different kind of purpose, one focused on serving his people rather than conquering opponents. The weight of their shared experiences created an almost tangible energy between them. They had been part of boxing's golden era, when the sport still commanded mainstream attention, and their fights had been must-see television events. Their two encounters had grossed over $50 million combined, but more importantly, they had provided moments of pure sporting drama that reminded the world why boxing, at its finest, was often called the theater of the unexpected. Around them, the modern world continued to document every second. Isagani, a young journalism student from Mindanao State University, live-streamed the encounter to his 1,000 followers, while Mayumi, a local news reporter, frantically called her station to dispatch a camera crew. The story was already being picked up by international sports networks, with retired boxers and current champions sharing their amazement on social media platforms. But perhaps the most powerful observer was Clarita, an 80-year-old grandmother who had watched both of their careers from the beginning. She remembered the young, hungry Manny, who used to train at the old Maharlika gym, throwing punches at makeshift heavy bags filled with sand and sawdust. She had prayed countless rosaries during his fights, and seeing him now, successful and dignified in his retirement, felt like witnessing the completion of a miracle she had helped pray into existence. Miguel raised his right hand slowly, a gesture that made several security guards tense momentarily before they recognized the peaceful intention. His palm extended toward Manny, not in aggression, but in acknowledgement, a warrior's salute to another warrior who had earned every ounce of respect through blood, sweat, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Manny's response was immediate and instinctive. His own hand rose to meet Miguel's, and when their palms touched, a ripple of emotion passed through the assembled crowd. It was a handshake that carried the weight of history, a gesture that officially closed the competitive chapter of their relationship while opening something entirely new. The moment stretched beyond its physical duration, becoming something that would be remembered and retold for generations of boxing fans, a reminder that the sport's greatest victories sometimes happened far from any ring. The handshake lingered for several heartbeats before both men naturally stepped back, their eyes never breaking contact. Something fundamental had shifted in that moment of connection. Years of separation dissolved, replaced by the unspoken bond that only former adversaries who had pushed each other to greatness could truly understand. The crowd sensed the change immediately, their excited murmurs giving way to a reverent silence. Without words or planned coordination, both legends began walking slowly down Pioneer Avenue, side by side. Their security teams quickly adjusted, forming a protective perimeter while allowing the natural flow of their movement. The assembled crowd followed at a respectful distance, creating an impromptu procession that would later be compared to a pilgrimage by those who witnessed it. Manny's thoughts drifted to the aftermath of their second fight in Mexico City. He had returned to his hotel room that night, his face swollen beyond recognition, nursing both physical pain and the sting of defeat. But even through his disappointment, he had felt a profound respect for Miguel's performance. The Mexican had fought with the heart of a true champion, and Manny knew that losing to such a warrior carried no shame, only lessons that would make him stronger. Miguel found himself remembering the moment differently. His victory celebration had been subdued, marked not by wild joy but by deep satisfaction and an unexpected sadness. Defeating Manny had felt like closing a chapter he wasn't quite ready to finish. The Filipino had brought out the absolute best in him, and Miguel knew that future opponents might never challenge him in the same transcendent way. As they walked, Jericho, a middle-aged carpenter who had saved for months to afford tickets to their first fight, wiped tears from his eyes. He had been in the MGM Grand that night, screaming himself hoarse as his Filipino hero battled the seemingly unbeatable Mexican champion. Seeing them together now, walking peacefully through the streets of General Santos, felt like witnessing the healing of an old wound he hadn't realized still existed. The procession passed by familiar landmarks of Manny's childhood. They walked past the corner where he used to sleep when his family couldn't afford rent, the spot where he sold cigarettes to drunk sailors, and the alley where he first learned to throw a punch in self-defense. Miguel observed everything with quiet fascination, understanding that he was being granted a rare glimpse into the origins of the man who had once been his greatest rival. Behind them, Luz Viminda, a retired schoolteacher, explained to her grandchildren the significance of what they were witnessing. She told them about the glory days of boxing, when fights like theirs could stop entire nations and bring families together around television screens. She spoke of honor, respect, and the way true champions conducted themselves long after their final bells had rung. The international sports media was already scrambling to understand the story unfolding in real time. Retired champions from around the world shared their amazement on social platforms, with many noting that such displays of sportsmanship and mutual respect had become increasingly rare in modern athletics. The encounter was being hailed as a masterclass in dignity and grace, but for Manny and Miguel, the external attention had faded into background noise. They were locked in their own bubble of shared understanding. Two men who had once been defined by their opposition to each other, now finding peace in their similarities. Both had risen from poverty through boxing. Both had used their success to help their communities. And both had learned that true victory extended far beyond any scorecards or championship belts. As they approached the old Maharlika gym where Manny had trained in his earliest professional days, Miguel paused and looked at the weathered building with something approaching reverence. This humble structure had helped forge the man who had challenged him to reach heights he never knew were possible, and that realization filled him with a gratitude he struggled to contain. The old Maharlika gym stood before them like a shrine to forgotten dreams, its corrugated metal roof bearing the scars of countless tropical storms and its concrete walls stained by decades of sweat and determination. The faded sign above the entrance had lost several letters, but the spirit of the place remained unmistakably powerful. Miguel felt his breath catch as he realized he was standing at the birthplace of one of boxing's greatest legends. Manny approached the gym's entrance with the careful reverence of a man returning to his childhood church. His fingers traced the worn wooden doorframe, remembering the countless times he had passed through this threshold, carrying nothing but hope and an unshakable belief that boxing might offer him an escape from poverty. The gym had been his sanctuary, his university, and his launching pad to the world. Inside, they could hear the familiar sounds of training, the rhythmic pounding of heavy bags, the squeak of boxing shoes on worn canvas, and the sharp exhales of fighters pushing their bodies to their limits. Renato, the current gym manager and a former sparring partner of Manny's, appeared in the doorway. His weathered face broke into a smile of pure amazement as he recognized both men, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured for them to enter. The interior of the gym was exactly as Manny remembered, though somehow smaller than his childhood memories had preserved it. The ring in the center was the same canvas where he had learned to slip punches and throw combinations that would later devastate world-class opponents. The heavy bags hanging from rusty chains were descendants of the equipment he had pounded until his knuckles bled, developing the power that would make him famous across the globe. Miguel walked slowly around the perimeter, his trained eye taking in every detail. The walls were covered with faded photographs of local champions, their black and white images serving as inspiration for the current generation of hopefuls. In one corner, he spotted a young fighter who couldn't have been more than 16, shadowboxing with the same intensity that Manny must have displayed decades earlier. The young boxer, Emil, stopped his training when he recognized the two legends in his midst. His eyes widened with disbelief, and his hands dropped to his sides as the magnitude of the moment overwhelmed him. Here, in his humble neighborhood gym, stood two men whose battles had defined an era of boxing. The teenager had watched their fights countless times on grainy YouTube videos, studying their techniques and dreaming of someday achieving even a fraction of their success. Manny noticed Emil's reaction and felt a profound connection to the young fighter's dreams. He remembered being exactly that age, training in this same space while fantasizing about fighting in great arenas instead of struggling to afford his next meal. The cyclical nature of ambition and hope struck him powerfully. How dreams were passed from generation to generation within these walls, each fighter carrying the torch forward while adding their own chapter to the gym's rich history. Around them, other fighters had stopped their training to witness this unprecedented gathering. Amihan, a female boxer who had just finished her workout, stood transfixed by the presence of two men who had inspired her to pursue boxing despite her family's objections. Joaquin, an aging trainer with arthritic hands, leaned against the ropes and marveled at how life had brought these former enemies together in the place where one of them had first learned to fight. Miguel found himself drawn to a corner where old equipment was stored. Among the collection of worn gloves and faded headgear, he could almost see the ghost of young Manny training with desperate intensity, throwing thousands of punches that would eventually carry him to 8 division championships. The Mexican champion felt humbled by the modesty of these origins, understanding more deeply than ever the incredible journey his former rival had traveled. The gym fell into a hushed stillness as both men absorbed the weight of standing together in this sacred space. Years of competition and separation had led to this moment of shared appreciation for the sport that had defined their lives and the humble places where greatness often began. The afternoon light streaming through the gym's high windows cast long shadows across the canvas, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as both legends found themselves naturally drawn toward the ring where so many dreams had been born and tested. Manny climbed through the ropes first, his movement still fluid despite the years since his retirement, while Miguel followed with equal grace, their combined presence transforming the humble training space into something approaching hallowed ground. Standing in the center of the ring, they were no longer the weathered men in their 60s who had met on the street corner, but echoes of their former selves, two of the greatest fighters who had ever lived, reunited in the place where one of them had first learned to dream beyond his circumstances. The young fighters gathered around the ring's perimeter, their training forgotten as they witnessed history unfolding before their eyes. Manny moved to the corner where he had received countless instructions from his first trainer, a tough old man named Teodoro, who had seen potential in a scrawny street kid when no one else would give him a chance. He could almost hear Teodoro's gruff voice echoing through the years, teaching him that boxing was as much about heart as it was about technique, that true champions were made not in moments of triumph, but in the quiet hours of preparation when no one was watching. Miguel observed Manny's reverent behavior with growing understanding. The Mexican champion had trained in modern facilities throughout his career, equipped with the latest technology and surrounded by teams of specialists. But seeing Manny's connection to this basic, no-frills gym made him realize that sometimes the most important lessons came from the simplest places, where fighters learned not just to box, but to dream of becoming something greater than their circumstances suggested possible. Around them, the gym's atmosphere had become electric with possibility. Andres, a promising welterweight who had been struggling with self-doubt, found his confidence rekindled simply by breathing the same air as these two legends. Clarita, an elderly woman who cleaned the gym each evening and had watched hundreds of young fighters come and go, wiped tears from her eyes as she realized she was witnessing the kind of moment that would be retold for generations. The younger fighters began to understand that they were receiving a masterclass in sportsmanship and respect that no textbook or video could provide. Watching Manny and Miguel share the ring with such mutual admiration taught them that true greatness extended far beyond championship belts or knockout records. It was about how you treated your opponents, how you carried yourself in victory and defeat, and how you honored the sport that had given you everything. Miguel found himself studying the ring's worn canvas, imagining the thousands of rounds that had been fought here by countless hopefuls. Some had gone on to regional success, others had discovered that boxing wasn't their calling, but all had contributed to the rich tapestry of dreams and determination that gave this place its unique energy. He felt privileged to stand where so many journeys had begun, understanding that he was connected to every fighter who had ever laced up gloves with hope in their heart. The two champions began moving around each other slowly, not in any aggressive manner, but in a graceful dance that demonstrated the beauty of boxing when stripped of its violent intentions. Their footwork was still precise, their balance still perfect, and watching them together was like seeing poetry in motion. The young fighters absorbed every detail, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that transcended mere athletic ability. As the golden hour light continued to fade, both men seemed to recognize that their time in this sacred space was drawing toward a conclusion. But the lessons being shared without a single word spoken would resonate long after they departed, inspiring a new generation of fighters to pursue their dreams with the same dignity and respect that these two legends had demonstrated throughout their careers. The ring had become a classroom, and everyone present understood they were receiving an education in greatness. Something magical began to unfold as the two champions found themselves naturally falling into the rhythms that had once defined their lives. Without any conscious decision or planning, Manny began throwing slow, controlled punches into the air, his muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. Miguel responded instinctively, his own hands rising in defensive positions, their bodies remembering the intricate chess match of elite-level boxing. What emerged was not a fight, but a demonstration of pure artistry. Two masters, showing the assembled crowd what boxing looked like when performed at its absolute pinnacle. Their movements were deliberate and measured, each technique executed with the precision that had made them legends. Manny's signature left hook cut through the air with devastating beauty, while Miguel's defensive mastery turned potential attacks into graceful evasions. The young fighters pressed closer to the ring, their eyes wide with wonder, as they witnessed techniques they had only seen in old fight footage now performed live before them. Rafael, a teenage bantamweight with dreams of turning professional, found himself unconsciously mimicking their footwork, his body trying to absorb the lessons being demonstrated without words. Miguel threw a slow-motion uppercut that Manny slipped with the same fluid grace that had frustrated opponents throughout his career. The Mexican champion marveled at how natural the movements still felt, how their bodies remembered every nuance of their fighting styles despite the passage of time. It was as if they were speaking a language that only they could fully understand, their hands and feet conducting a conversation that transcended any need for words. Isadora, a local sports journalist who had somehow gained entry to witness this historic encounter, frantically scribbled notes while trying to capture the indescribable beauty of what she was seeing. Her words felt inadequate to describe the poetry in motion unfolding before her, the way two former enemies had transformed their ring into a stage for displaying the highest form of athletic artistry. The demonstration continued for several mesmerizing minutes, with both men moving through combinations and defensive sequences that showcased why they had once been considered among the greatest fighters alive. Their breathing remained controlled, their movements economic and purposeful, each gesture a reminder of the countless hours they had dedicated to perfecting their craft. Around the ring, even the gym's maintenance staff had stopped their work to watch. Marilu, who had been mopping the floors when the legends arrived, leaned on her mop handle with tears streaming down her face. She had cleaned this gym for 15 years, watching countless fighters train with varying degrees of dedication, but nothing had prepared her for witnessing such a display of mastery and mutual respect. As their impromptu demonstration reached its natural conclusion, both men gradually slowed their movements until they stood facing each other in the center of the ring, their hands dropping to their sides. The exertion had brought a healthy glow to their faces, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away completely, revealing glimpses of the young warriors they had once been. The silence in the gym was profound, broken only by the sound of their controlled breathing and the distant noise of traffic from the street outside. Every person present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a display of technical excellence, but a demonstration of how true champions honored their sport and each other long after their competitive days had ended. Miguel looked around the humble gym with new appreciation, understanding that greatness could emerge from the most unlikely places when combined with unwavering determination and proper guidance. This modest training facility had produced one of boxing's all-time greats, proving that champions were made not by fancy equipment or luxurious surroundings, but by the fire that burned within a fighter's heart. The moment felt like a bridge between past and future, with two legends passing their wisdom to the next generation through actions rather than words, their demonstration serving as both a masterclass and a blessing for every dreamer who dared to step through those gym doors. As the two legends prepared to leave the ring, something profound passed between them that would later be described by witnesses as almost supernatural in its emotional intensity. Miguel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, worn photograph, a picture of both men from their weigh-in before their first fight, when they were young warriors with everything to prove and the world watching their every move. Manny's eyes widened with recognition and surprise as Miguel extended the photograph toward him. The Mexican champion had carried this image for over 2 decades, a reminder of the night that had changed both their lives forever. The photo showed them staring intensely at each other across the scales, their faces masks of concentration and determination, neither man knowing they were about to embark on a rivalry that would define an era of boxing. Without hesitation, Manny pulled out his own wallet and retrieved an identical photograph, one he had kept close for all these years. The sight of both men holding the same treasured memory created a moment so powerful that several witnesses later claimed they felt the presence of something greater than themselves in that humble gym. The realization that they had both preserved the same moment from their shared history hit them simultaneously. Here were two men from different countries and cultures who had spent years preparing to hurt each other, Yet both had secretly honored their connection by carrying these photographs like talismans throughout their lives. Emile, the young fighter who had been training when they arrived, watched with tears streaming down his face as the two champions carefully exchanged photographs. The gesture was simple, yet profound. Each man now possessed the other's treasured memory, creating a bond that would endure long after they parted ways. As they climbed down from the ring for the final time, the assembled crowd maintained their respectful silence, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing the conclusion of something historic. Josefina, an elderly woman who had followed Manny's career since his amateur days, clutched her grandson's hand tightly, whispering that this was what true champions looked like when they had nothing left to prove to anyone. The walk toward the gym's exit felt ceremonial, each step weighted with the significance of closure and new beginnings. Behind them, the young fighters gradually returned to their training, but their movements carried a different energy now. They had been touched by greatness and would never train the same way again. Outside the gym, the crowd had grown to nearly 1,000 people, with news crews arriving from major networks around the world. But Manny and Miguel barely noticed the cameras and microphones thrust in their direction. They were locked in their own bubble of mutual understanding and respect, two men who had found peace with their shared past. As Miguel's SUV pulled up to take him back to his hotel, both men knew this would likely be their final meeting. Age and geography would conspire to keep them apart, but the connection forged today would endure forever. They embraced briefly, a gesture that felt natural and necessary, sealing their transformation from rivals to something approaching brotherhood. The photographs of their embrace spread across social media within minutes, shared millions of times, and accompanied by tributes from fans, fighters, and celebrities around the globe. The hashtag #2Legends dominated trending topics in dozens of countries, with the boxing community celebrating what many called the greatest display of sportsmanship they had ever witnessed. As Miguel's vehicle disappeared into the traffic, Manny stood alone on the street corner where their encounter had begun hours earlier. In his hand, he clutched Miguel's photograph, understanding that he now possessed a piece of history that would forever remind him of the day when two old warriors had proven that the greatest victories sometimes happened far from any scoreboard. The boxing world had been moved not by violence or controversy, but by the simple beauty of two great men honoring their shared journey with dignity, respect, and love. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.